Brandon,
What is up, man?
we are back with this extremely big episode. Last, I think 2 weeks ago, we had a big monster on, and now we have another big monster on today. Now, today is a very, very important episode for myself and for Brian and even this platform. Um, it's one of my, meeting your hero type of things. We have the big Doctor, Mr. Eric Helms, with us today. Welcome,
Well,
man.
it's a pleasure and a privilege. I appreciate the intro, and I always surprise me when people tell me that I am someone of that import, because most of the time I just feel like I'm talking to a screen or Omar, which is slightly more engaging than my screen. So no, but truly, it's a pleasure and a privilege. Thanks for having me on.
Right, yeah. But we being, the lifting nerds, we talk a lot about lifting and, different types of lifting and everything, a lot of what the evidence-based community actually talks about and how to, we share a lot of our experiences and a lot of our science researches that you make, Greg makes, and then we share them out to the public and try to be the best communicators that we can to make lifting a lot more safer and a lot more efficient for the rest of the community. So we thank you for doing all this research and, making it easy for us to understand. Reading those research papers can be quite hectic when your English isn't that good for such as myself. But yes, so we do have, many people know you as, the top of the pyramid of the cult, showing your calves first, as we say it. But still, for what's happening, I know Sheffield is happening for you, and you're very excited for Sheffield. I hear it every single episode of every week on Iron Culture. So besides Sheffield, I know you're prepping, and I was reading one of the footnotes that you'll be 40.
I am going to be soon.
When?
Berto just turned 40 like a couple days ago, and he is like 5 or 6 weeks older than me. So I am going to be 40 next month.
Yeah, I saw that on Instagram. That's awesome.
Yeah, in April. Yes, sir.
You're Taurus.
Yes, I am. Good call. Most people think I'm a what's the other one? Aries next to it?
Aries, yeah.
Yeah, but no, I'm further enough along in April. Or early enough? I don't know. I don't really pay attention to my sign, so
that's fine.
Yeah.
I thought you were younger than me. I thought
don't.
You and Brian were younger than me.
I am 28.
Yeah. Okay.
You're 28.
So, yeah, you're 28. Yeah. So
that's the same age as me. So
yeah, I've turned 28 for my 12th time coming up in April. So yeah, it's a good time.
Congratulations. But that's great. Yeah. I will also be taking my master's in 2025.
Nice. Where are you planning on doing your master's?
Oh, sorry, not my master's degree.
Oh,
my
becoming
master's
yes. Right. My bad. My bad. See, too much academia is in my brain sometimes. Nice. Cool. That's not far off. Yeah. Nice.
Yeah. So I'll be 40 in 2025. I'm still sticking around for WNBF, as I just did the Calgary show back in end of October. That's where I got to meet Alberto. Big privilege as well. He was just surrounded by people, so I could, get my hands on him.
Yeah. The sea of hair admirers. That's right.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. But what is your expectation going into your your competition? I'm really, really excited for that.
Yeah, I think for me it's really just seeing if I've made any kind of improvements that are noticeable since 2019. And specifically the kind of specific work I put in, specifically the specific work that I specifically put into my body. I did a lot of specialization on my delts and lats and calves. So if those look exactly the same, then I'm just going to quit. No, kidding. But no, it's going to be it's interesting. The kind of the off-season experiment was, how do these specialization cycles work, and do they operate the way we hope they do? And obviously I can't, make broad conclusions based upon just how it impacts me. But yeah, it's I like the process of figuring out how to make gains when there's very, like it's harder to have them happen when you're an advanced lifter. So yeah, and then you can't really tell as a drug-free lifter who is, later in their career until you diet down if those changes really produce some qualitative visual effects. So yeah, I'm hopeful. I feel like I see some differences this stage, but I'm still like 20 pounds over stage weight. Um, so yeah, expectations for me are get as shredded as I ever have, if not more so. Um, and yeah, like just do a bunch of shows and see what happens. So I'm excited to be shifted back in the season. Typically my seasons end somewhere between like August, September. That's been the way it's been since '09. Uh, and this time I didn't even start dieting until February. So the plan is to get on stage from September to November. So I mean, it should be roughly the same, just starting a couple months later and then ending a couple months later. But it gives me the opportunity to compete at WBF Worlds, which I'm looking forward to, assuming I qualify. So I just have to do well enough as an amateur, or so well enough as an amateur that I'm no longer an amateur, and then I've got the pathway to Worlds, which I'm really looking forward to.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So Worlds is probably the one that you want to like peak the best at, like the other shows. I guess you kind of have to qualify for that, but you'll probably be kind of feeding into Worlds essentially, and like probably dieting down to like the first show and then kind of slowly ramping things up towards the end of the prep.
I think if I'm on pace, I should be getting in peak leanness. I will say that instead of condition in August, and that should give me enough time to be eating up into all of the shows.
Oh,
So I'm hopeful. I mean, sometimes you never like filling up into shows is an interesting thing, and sometimes you get better show to show. And then depending on how long you try to sustain that, sometimes you can get worse. But all of my shows are packed into a window where like I don't have the full show scheduled yet. I don't think I think WNBF New Zealand probably this weekend is going to let us know the exact date on their show, but we're looking at probably end of September to mid-November. So it's just going to be like almost every weekend I'm competing. So um so it'll be interesting, and I think uh it's certainly possible that I could improve. I think it's unlikely that I'll be getting worse based on how tight they all are packed. And the way it works for Worlds is if you turn pro, you get an invite that year. And then the rules have changed over the years. I'm not actually currently sure what the WBF Pro rules are for qualifying. It has been sometimes placed in the top half. Apologies, my phone beeping. And I think for amateurs, it's placing top. It depends on how many are in the class and in the competition, but it's typically like top 3 or sometimes top 2 if it's a smaller class. So I think I've got a pretty good shot at getting there either way. So one of the two ways. But yeah.
Was your last season, was it 2019 or was it 2017? I was
2019.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
Nice.
Yeah. Berto's last one was 2017.
Oh, okay. That's what I was thinking of then.
Yep. Yep.
So what is your current split right now?
Yeah, so I have 5 days where I train, and I just distribute the my training across the week. Across the 5 days, just based upon like trying to avoid overlap and what do I want to have, more emphasis on exercises or volumes of training for a given muscle group where I'm probably going to need some recovery time. I'm potentially going to do a powerlifting meet in June, so I have right now my organization is built a little bit around the big three. But I'm only doing the competition specific lifts at the moment once a week each. And then I have some movements that I've selected that I think are good assistance work for those that are also useful bodybuilding movements, like a medium grip bench press, for example. I think it's just a great chest builder and push exercise, but also it's really good for bench press assistance, just as an example. So yeah, it's I hesitate to call it full body because that always gives people the wrong impression. Like every day I'm doing a leg press or something like that. So it is like there's some days where the only thing I do for my lower body is like a calf raises, or another day where it's only hamstring curls. So it's more just like I'm not limiting my distribution of selection to body parts on a given day. So it's basically just free flowing organization of volume, which I just find works best for me, not necessarily everybody. It takes a little more like finagling and messing with things and thinking about overlap, but I'm a finagler, so it's fine.
Yeah. So because what it just gives me a little bit of insight just by listening to you and Brian's first half of the conversation for lower body, which would probably like segue into the deeper questions later.
Sure.
But about the volume per week per muscle group. So as you know, the research says, what third was it? Shit, remind me again. It was like 30 to 30, 40 sets per muscle group per week. Was that the stat? 30
So there's two meta analyses on volume per week per muscle group. There is Schoenfeld's 2017 one, which looked at studies as high as 15 sets per week per muscle group. And it categorized them in 1 to 4, 5 to 9, and 10 plus. And then there was Bas-Val, which is a much smaller meta-analysis because it always needed something that was over 12 to be analyzed. And it looked at less than 12, 12 to 20, or 20 plus. And there was only like 7 studies in total, if I recall correctly. And when they started looking at individual muscle groups, sometimes you're looking at 2 or 3 studies. So I think taking a broader take from the Bas-Val meta-analysis is probably better. But we basically have data on like 1 to 20 for the most part. And where you start to see what I would describe qualitatively, we don't actually have like an analysis that does this across 2 meta-analyses. They did do a meta-regression in the 2017 meta-analysis. So what a meta-regression is just statistically, real briefly, you can break studies up into different groups and be like, okay, groups that did, or the studies where they had 1 to 4 sets, 5 to 9, 10 plus. And then you can also just plot them all on the same line, if you will, and then just look at the relationship. Like, okay, as sets go up, what happens to hypertrophy? So in the Schoenfeld meta-analysis, they did actually do an assessment to see, like, is there a dose-response relationship? And there was. And it was significant. It wasn't strong. And when you look at like the effect size relative in each group, it seems to maybe start plateauing or diminishing. But the overall conclusion was, hey, you want to get the most out of it despite the greater time investment. It's 10 plus sets. Important caveat there, though, is that if you did tricep pushdowns and a chest press, and you did 3 sets each, they count that as 6 sets for triceps. So that's including indirect work. As also most of the sets are to failure, and a fair number of the participants in these studies were untrained. So it's not quite as it's not really a win for high volume, in my opinion, as it looks like, because it's not saying you need to do 10 sets of triceps. It's saying, hey, even when you count indirect work, that that counts. And then anyway, the Bas-Val one essentially found that on the whole, and I'm speaking more broadly, 20 plus sets wasn't better than 12 to 20. So but 12 to 20 was a little better than less than 12. So the general recommendation I make, like if you look at the muscle strength pyramids, is like to do 10 to 20 sets per muscle group. And there are individual studies where higher volumes in the range you mentioned do better for typically hypertrophy, not strength. But there's also the opposite, where that's not the case. And I think it's probably better to rely on the kind of the collective look at the data. So I generally wouldn't recommend more than 20 sets until I have individual data that would indicate for that person, or for that specific muscle in that person, that is what's necessary for them to break a plateau or grow, etc. And typically before I'm getting that high in volume, I want to see videos of their lifts. I want to see their nutrition. I want to see their sleep habits, their recovery. Because a lot of the time we're making up for poor quality of the whole bodybuilding environment with more quantity. And that's typically a losing proposition, in my opinion, because then you're like, oh, my recovery is shitty, my form's shitty, let's do more. Like, well, hold on, So yeah, there's a lot of nuance around it, but I think in absence of other more individualized information, 10 to 20 sets per muscle group per week, including indirect work, is a good way to understand the population level average of what's an appropriate volume.
That makes sense. For the For the 30 to 40 sets per week, is that including indirect work too, or is that just like direct work for those
The 30
studies?
to 40 sets, I think when there's not that many studies that go that high.
Okay.
And the couple of studies that do, I believe they also were counting indirect and direct work. I think the study by Schoenfeld. But yeah, I would have to go back and look at it. But I think again, there are just as many, if not more, studies that suggest that's not going to be better than less volume. So
That makes sense. That's kind of how my experience has been too. Like with working with Jeff Alberts too, we kind of toned back my volume because I'm actually in competition prep right now, 3 weeks out from my first show this season.
heck,
And like I was like training 5 days per week, and now I'm down to training 4 days per week with a little bit less volume, and I feel so much better than I did last competition preps. Like I'm like, even like my diet fatigue is quite down too, and like I'm able to like push and still progress with my isolation movements. So I'm like, shit, like I feel so much better now rather than past preps where I was doing like 5, 6 days per week, like so much more volume. So like it's definitely been helping me out a lot.
yeah, and I think that's a great example of taking individual data over time and being able to assess, what's appropriate for me. Um, because the conversation about volume is really not that useful at the population level. When you can find studies where there are individual responses which indicate not a majority, but a sizable proportion of people might even respond not just similarly, but actually better to lower volume. So there's a 2019 secondary analysis of a study that Demas did where they compared training a muscle group 5 times a week with 3 sets, so 15 sets per week, and then crossed over, and then they did 2 to 3 times a week, training 3 sets per. So again, we're looking at like 6 to 9 sets versus 15 sets, slightly different frequency, but based on the data we have, that shouldn't make a huge difference. And something like a third of the people did better on the lower volume. A quarter did about the same, and then a third did better on the other. And there's like some overlap there, depending on whether the outcome is strength or hypertrophy. And if you just look at the raw data, like the direction, even if they got like negligibly better, and it's probably this measurement error, it was basically a 50-50 split as to who did better one way or the other. Now, that's not a meta-analysis, it's just one study. So it's just a smaller sample, and that's not as generalizable as the meta-analyses are. But the point is if what actually happened, some exercise science researchers and students got together, recruited 19 people. Half of them did better on lower volume, half of them did better on higher volume. So you wouldn't be like, oh, therefore everyone needs to do this volume. You'd be like, oh, we probably should figure out individually what's best. And I think ultimately that is the best recommendation. And you just kind of need to know, like, okay, well, what's the ballpark I start in? Because if you don't have that kind of data framing, then you're going to be influenced by whatever you find online. Some jack dude who follows like a Mike Menser 4.0 approach, that's going on today. Like you might see quite popular in the UK, where it's 2 sets per exercise, 1 to 2 times a week. So we're talking, really low volume. Or you might find someone who's, like taking a bastardized RP approach and forgot that they ever said MAV and just went with MRV all the time, and they're doing, 40 sets. And if they look great, and if they're clients who have stuck with them and survived, more so survived in the latter case, are reporting great results, that can give you this social media appearance of, oh, this is obviously better. And their rhetoric will be similar as well, because it's so influenced by their personal perspective. So that's kind of the advantage to looking at something a little more objective and an actual random sample from the population rather than this curated feed that shows you someone who looks amazing. Because the reality is since Mike Menser, he got on stage with Arnold Schwarzenegger, polar opposite approaches, and that's continued. So the reality is that you can make great progress on. I'll say this: one can make great progress on either higher or lower volumes, emphasizing further proximity to failure to accommodate the volume, or closer proximity to failure to do lower volumes, and emphasizing quality or quantity. But you don't know who one is. You have to figure out what you need, and it's probably somewhere in the range of 10 to 20 in most cases. And you extend that a little bit to include maybe 2 standard deviations from the mean, and now we're talking like 6 to 30. So yeah, I think so long as people I think you're already wrong if you're trying to figure out a generalizable volume for everyone, because that's not a thing, when it comes to prescription. Now, if you've been program hopping for a year and that's your entire newbie gain experience, you actually don't know, because most newbies will do great either way. And now you need to actually start on something. I don't know what to do. I've done everything from low volume to high volume in my first year, and I made gains just because I'm a newbie. So I don't have an exercise history or a controlled observation of what I did to tell what's best for me. So therefore, I might as well guess. And if I'm gonna guess, now I'm basically just going to Vegas and rolling the dice. I should bet on red or black, right? Because that's the highest probability. And the equivalent of red or black is going to be 10 to 20 sets per muscle group based upon the data.
That makes sense. With that being said, too, like you mentioned, like the different participants, like one doing a little bit better with low volume, one doing a bit better with higher volume. Do you think it could be possible that the person that did low volume was a little bit more, like their form was maybe just a little bit more on point, and that they were maybe pushing a little bit more than like the other people in the studies were? Like how well do you think those are controlled in terms of like form, technique, and tempo and stuff like that? Do you find there's a lot of variability in that when it comes to those studies?
So that's the beauty of some of these study designs, is that there are basically three ways to take care of that. One, you do what's called the within subject design. So that means one of their legs is on one protocol, the other leg is on the other, and that's describes some of these studies. Another way is to do a crossover, meaning that everyone gets randomized to do one of the protocols first, and you have an equal number of people that did one protocol first and equal number of people that did the other protocol first. So those both take care of that consideration and all. The third one is just to make sure that you have a sufficient sample size. And then any differences that would be expected between participants should be evenly distributed across the two groups. And that third one is likely to have happened, but certainly possible that it doesn't, because in exercise science, we often don't have large enough sample sizes. But the Moss study specifically that we're referring to actually fell into those earlier categories. So probably not. In fact, definitely not. So
Okay. Makes
yeah,
sense.
it is the independent effect of different volumes and basically the same people. So
Okay, makes sense. Makes sense.
yeah, man.
Sweet.
Yeah, because Brandon, you mentioned something about variance and technique, which you also previously mentioned, and that kind of just gives me just a little bit of another question that I'm going to segue away on. You said you would film your athletes on how they executed the exercise. So what type of variables would you be considering? Like, I would assume tempo, the actual execution, how much knee flexion, how much hip, well, whatever they're doing. Let's say of a squat, how much knee flexion they're doing, how much hip flexion they were doing. I assume that you will look at all that. Is there any like other stuff that you would for muscle hypertrophy, just for saying, if somebody is prepping, because all me and Brandon talk about is just bodybuilding. Like, we're just meatheads. We're just in natural bodybuilding meatheads. So we find the most hardest way to do these exercises, just to get a better pump out of it. So what are some of the variables that you actually look at if an athlete like would be sending you these type of exercise executions?
Absolutely. So the big ones are knowing the range of motion they're training through, and then also their proximity to failure. So their perception of having a full range of motion and their perception of how quote unquote hard they're training. Obviously, there's more that goes into how hard you're training than proximity to failure, but it's a big determinant. Those are the two big ones. And then a close third is their kind of qualitative technique, which, how does that matter? Why does that matter? Things like generating momentum or having body English, if you will, at the point where that can take away from the key tension point. So for example, if you're doing a bent over row, right? And the initiation of the movement where your arms are longest starts with you standing up a little bit and then humping down into it. You've now taken the point where the lat is elongated and the tension is highest and kind of cheated out of it, right? Now, if you're doing a dumbbell lateral raise and at the very top, you kind of drop down to get the last few range of motion, that probably doesn't matter. Yeah, it's the point when the lever arm is the longest and when it's the hardest, but it's not the point when the muscle is the longest. So, I mean, I would probably just have the person do a cable lateral raise in the first place, but it's just to illustrate the point that there are times when cheating probably doesn't matter that much. And there are times when a reduced range of motion probably doesn't matter that much. So for example, if I see a video of somebody doing dips and they're stopping, going 2/3 of the way up and just kind of, hanging out in the middle bottom, so what, right? They're staying in the position where the triceps are elongated in the most part. Now, if you'd gone back to 2010, personal trainer Eric, I'd be like, lock the tricep all the way out. What's wrong with you? But from a hypertrophy standpoint, we know that the benefits of a full range of motion primarily come down to training at a long muscle length, right? So that's kind of something to layer onto your perspective of what is good form for hypertrophy is, are you escaping the fire? You don't want to do that, right? You want to be, as people might say, you want to stay in the pocket, right? So when the movement is hardest, and this is the layered element, when the muscle is its longest point, and hopefully if you can align up the tension curve with the longest muscle lengths, that's kind of good exercises for hypertrophy. That's when you want to be making sure that you are quote unquote in the pocket, exerting a lot of effort, and essentially that's what I'm looking for. So if someone is training close to failure, but each time they're hitting failure, they're kind of avoiding that very challenging portion of the range of motion where the muscle is also longest, or if they're cutting depth or cutting range of motion throughout an exercise, like sometimes that bent over row, for example, starts to turn into like this RDL
Shrug.
top end range. Yeah, exactly. Shrug, or like an Olympic lifting movement without the skill, then yeah, you want to modify that. And sometimes people don't have the requisite experience or body awareness to deal with that. So you just change the exercise. Like it's hard to mess up a bench row. It's like aka seal row, as an example. A lot of people, I would almost say the majority of people, do something with a bent over row to where it's because like your body's just trying to figure out how do I do this thing that my brain is telling me to do, how do I touch this bar to my chest, right? So if you remove some of the ability for you to shift away from that position, then you can kind of stay there. And it takes less mental effort too, which then you can just focus on applying force, right? So I think there's something to be said for setting yourself up in a position to succeed rather than kind of keeping some of the traditional exercises that are on a pedestal. Like bent over rows, I used to think forever, you got to do them. Because I mean, look at Ronnie Coleman, look at Dorian Yates. They have huge backs. They say bent over rows are important. I've never seen a program that doesn't have bent over rows in them. I'd be an idiot not to do them, right? So I don't think like that anymore. Hint, hint. That's probably something to move away from. That's relatively dogmatic, in my opinion. It's not necessarily a bad exercise, which is also not what I'm saying. But I think understanding what is actually causing hypertrophy, what's related to it, what does good quote unquote technique even mean in the context of one's goals. I rambled a lot, but basically I could have just said, are they as close to failure as I think they are? And are they escaping the long range of motion, high tension part of the movement? And I could have stopped talking, but I didn't.
That's fine. Because it kind of leads to this other question that I've listed in, previously. It's apparently this question has been going around in China, and it's a very popular question right now that I think you're the first person that I actually would ask you. So I'm just gonna like say this. So there's people have been talking about like training lower body.
Okay.
Has proven to be, to benefit overall muscle hypertrophy, which I was brought up during my newbie gains. That was the case. You have to do barbell squats in order to get your upper body to grow. That's that type of myth. So, do the quad, glute, ham, because they're bigger muscles, but then it's, as you guys talked about it with Brian, it's a lot more demanding for your CNS. So with all these programs out there, push-pull legs, I know Jeff Nippers has a lot of push-pull leg versions, and then 5-day splits, what I'm doing right now, and, full body splits, even, Brandon, you're doing like 4-day splits, is there like the difference between the recovery and, if there's a benefit to actually training your lower body to benefit your upper body type of deal?
Probably not. I mean, I don't think so. Like one fun thing to look at is bench only athletes, either in the Paralympics or the people who just do bench only in powerlifting. I don't think the thing that would help them, get even stronger bench presses would be squatting and deadlifting. And in fact, the bench only records are higher than the bench press and the full lift competitions. Um, and there's been speculation around this forever, like the clearly disproven at this point kind of quote unquote hormone hypothesis, that basically the transient increases in testosterone and growth hormone following a resistance training session are what's causing the majority of hypertrophy, or even some of it, is been basically debunked. If both through the data of different rep ranges, because you can take the same volume of training and restrict your rest interval, and you can get a higher growth hormone response, which really just comes down to making sure that you're able to supply the energy for the demand. And if you're increasing the quote unquote density of training, doing more in a shorter period, there's a different way that your body does that, and that includes seeing some growth hormone release, which is related to the lactate. Anyway, so we see that it is volume, not necessarily the rest interval, that is the biggest predictor of hypertrophy. And if anything, when you drop your rest interval, which gives you a higher growth hormone response, the data skews towards that can actually hurt hypertrophy. And there has been mixed data to try to look at the idea of basically does this systemic hormonal and metabolic response to training have an impact on like other muscle groups that aren't the one you're directly training. So there's been a couple of studies where what they've done is like have someone do squats and then do bicep curls to see if it actually benefits it. And I think those two specific studies, one found a benefit and one didn't. And I would say the overall balance of the evidence is like it's probably not going to do much. And it also helps to think about like what are the actual elevations we see in this post-workout period in growth hormone and testosterone, and they're eclipsed by like the diurnal variation in testosterone and growth hormone. So they're blips, and they only last like an hour. So thinking like there's a 10% increase in these hormones is not the same as like blasting and cruising growth hormone and testosterone exogenously and being an IFBB pro. Although we've always talked about it that way. Like I've even gone to seminars like, look, you're a natural lifter. You got to take advantage of this growth hormone response post workout because all muscle only grows because of growth hormone and testosterone. Like we have this kind of biased perspective on what causes hypertrophy because we see such massive hypertrophy in enhanced bodybuilders, and forgetting that like there's a whole lot of muscle growth that occurs before you kind of then jump on the sauce, and that is above and beyond and different and exogenous. It's not totally different, but it is different enough that it's not the same as your endogenous hormone production. And if it was, like, women wouldn't be able to grow muscle at all. You'd see it wouldn't be dudes in their 40s and 50s still winning world titles in natural bodybuilding. So it's just not the most important thing. You wouldn't have any muscle as a guy or woman on stage by the time you diet it down, because you sometimes you get to like 1/4 your testosterone levels, and that doesn't predict muscle retention. We don't see these kind of very clear relationships. So yeah, all the data I've seen would indicate that hypertrophy for the most part is a local process, not entirely, but certainly heavily influenced by that. Um, and then the indirect effects, certainly when you are doing a lot of compound lower body lifts, it can absolutely negatively impact just your ability to perform well on other movements. I mean, anyone who's done a hard leg day knows that the third movement, if they had put it first, is not going to perform as well. And that is a systemic effect, right? It's cardiovascularly fatiguing to do squats, leg presses, deadlifts, any exercise to some degree. But the more muscle mass that's involved, the more fatigue you're going to generate. So that's just kind of, I don't think that's unique to lower body versus upper body. That's just quads and glutes and hamstrings are a lot of muscle mass. So if we had some genetically engineered kind of species of humans where they had itty bitty legs and a big upper body, the conversation would flip, right? So I think it's just kind of good to look at it from that kind of broken down perspective, that it's not something magic about lower body training that enhances upper body training. And we've kind of left behind the acute impact of these hormones during training a while ago, and we probably should keep it that way, and instead just think about it from the perspective of, oh, like, it's hard to train these exercises, and if you're fatigued, then it's gonna be hard to do anything else, regardless of whether it's upper body or lower body.
Yeah, that's
Makes
true.
sense.
As you mentioned, when you said like itty bitty legs, when like extremely large body, it's the first thing that the closest thing that as human beings that we relate to are gorillas or apes. They kind of carry that very very well developed upper body compared to their lower body. And their upper body limbs are. I don't know if there's any relevance in these two type of biology in there, if they've done these type of researches on apes and humans and see if they respond very similarly.
I can't tell if you're being facetious right now. Have we done training studies in gorillas? No, we haven't. Are you trolling me right now? I'm not even.
No, that was actually a general question, but I don't know. But maybe it's not part of the
Okay.
conversation. It's not part of the conversation because it's more of a biological question than something we know. Because we
If we
can't
can
literally
get Jane
train.
Goodall,
Yeah, we can't literally make gorillas. Hey man, do like 15 bicep curls and just see how your muscle growth,
no.
grows within those 8 weeks. We can't make them do that.
If we get them all smartphones and Instagram accounts, and then if Jane Goodall can get really, really interested in bodybuilding and then trains a group of apes to do that, we could answer this question. I think that's certainly not been done yet. Could happen in the future. Yes.
We never know. We never know.
Right. That's right.
That's awesome. One question that I did have, because I noticed like there's a lot more research now talking about longer muscle lengths and
Mm.
training possibly in partials and stuff like that. And I've noticed with like you and like Alberto Nunez doing like regular sets with full range of motion and then using like heavier loads after and doing like partials. And then I know like Alberto Nunez right now with a lot of his training, he's doing like 3-second pauses in that stretch position. Um, what do you think the utility of utilizing more of that in our training, especially when we get closer to reaching our genetic cap? Do you think that's something that could potentially get us past like where we're currently at if we're in our 10 to 15 years of like lifting naturally?
Perhaps. Yeah. I think the most important thing is just that there is a decent amount of tension supplied at these long muscle lengths when you kind of look at where the overall body of literature fits together. One thing that I'm not a huge fan of is basically going, oh, if we need to train at long muscle lengths and an exercise doesn't, train or have its highest tension point at that, just go past failure, right? Because now we're to some degree changing our understanding of proximity to failure based upon a lower tier of evidence. Like we understand this is a thing, but we don't have data showing, like going past failure and reducing your range of motion is like better than the training we have done previously. We just know that long muscle lengths are important and having a decent amount of tension there. So I think there's a lot of ways to get there. You can pause in the bottom of a rep and just spend more of your time there. You could do partials at longer muscle lengths. You could also just change. This is kind of the way I do it, is just change what I decide is the minimum range of motion before I stop. So the way I used to do, let's say a cable row, for example, is if I can't touch my chest, it's not a full rep. So I hit a 10 RPE because I'm an inch away from my chest, right? Now I just go, all right, it's 2/3 of the range of motion. When I can no longer get 2/3 of the range of motion, that's when I stop. And that's actually like 4 or 5 more reps, or 3 sometimes, depending on the kind of load and rep range you're training in. And it just makes sense to me that, listen, when my arm is fully out in front of me, that's actually when the lat's more stretched. It's when the mid scapula is more, the scapular retractors and protractors are more, sorry, retractors are more stretched. So why am I limiting myself just by this kind of objective but relatively arbitrary range of motion? So I'm going to change the arbitrary range of motion so that it gives me more time spent in an elongated position. Because maybe certain fibers are basically at a 3 RIR lower in terms of the functional effect. And is that having a negative effect? Perhaps. I think it's certainly worth trying, not necessarily related to your training age or how close you are to your genetic potential, but just if you've never done that before. Like, for example, if you've only done dumbbell lateral raises your whole career and you've never done cables, or even more so, cables where you kind of or do like a crossbody holster draw, or behind your back, so you're kind of reaching back like you're going to itch your butt, and instead you do a lateral raise. Don't actually itch your butt. That's not appropriate for the gym. Both of those are because you've never actually put a high degree of tension with your delt in that stretch of the position. The closest thing is probably doing like an overhead press. There may be some untapped gains there. So it's not necessarily that you got to change it up because you're close to your potential, but it's like that's actually a novel stimulus for you. It's a perspective that I might have on it.
Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And with the training for muscle hypertrophy, would you say it's probably best to try to take the stretch reflex pretty much out of most movements? Or do you think like having some movements where you're kind of bouncing, or like say for example, like a squat, if you're utilizing the stretch reflex a little bit, do you think that's gonna be, I guess, less like optimal for muscle hypertrophy? Or do you think that's fine to have some movements where you're utilizing a little bit of stretch reflex?
I think it's perfectly fine because the data we have suggests that it's not just active tension, and I'll explain what that means in a second, that contributes to hypertrophy, but also passive tension. So when you have what we call the stretch shortening cycle or stretch reflex, or just the rebound in when you are transitioning from the eccentric to the concentric, there is a point when you're getting passive tension generation that's contributing to force. And that's a combination of both outside of the muscle and intramuscular structures. So when you have a high velocity or high force eccentric contraction followed by immediately by an explosive concentric action, you're having some elastic recoil, not only from the tendon, but also the titin molecule. And that does actually transfer that elastic force to the rest of the muscle and structures. And one thing to consider is that long duration static stretching produces hypertrophy. That's not active tension, right? You're not contracting. You're just sitting there holding a high degree of tension. So I actually don't think you need to necessarily pause to get the most out of it for that reason. And I do think passive tension probably does contribute to hypertrophy, or we wouldn't have this whole conversation about stretch mediated hypertrophy. However, if we know that being in a long muscle length and producing higher tension is important, and the duration might matter, you could also make an argument saying, well, I just want to spend more of my time lifting in a longer range of motion. And it doesn't matter if I lose a rep or two because you're staying at a point where it's the hardest and hanging out that pausing on your chest on bench press. You can't lift as much weight. You can't do as many reps with the same weight. Is that a problem though? Well, for hypertrophy, probably not. Now you've got whatever proportion of your total amount of time spent doing bench press, a large proportion of it is in that lengthened position. And you could say the same thing for that example of the person who's not locking out on dips, right? If they're only doing 2/3 of the range of motion, and that's all of their reps, a greater proportion of that total time spent producing force in the tricep is in a longer position. And it could actually be better. There's actually a study by, I think, Pedrosa and colleagues where there was a slight outperformance, or I should say better performance in terms of hypertrophy in the group that wasn't doing full range of motion. They only did the bottom third of the leg extension compared to the group that did the full range. And they both include that bottom range, but it might just be that the effort and time and metabolic output of doing that top range of motion is taking away from the amount of time and effort they could put into the elongated portion. And this is speculative. This is like one subgroup finding in a large group. I don't know that long muscle length partials are going to actually outperform traditional training with a full range of motion that includes that same range of motion, but it's certainly worth exploring. And side note, we are going to be exploring that pretty soon in a study led by Milo Wolf as part of his PhD, and we're doing a multi-site data collection. So keep your eye on that space, I guess.
Yeah, and we'll have Kai put it in the footnotes, right?
That's right.
So it actually leads to a really a side note because it would probably apply to myself as well as some of my own athletes, for where everything we've just talked about, does that reflect on just novice lifters, intermediate lifters, and advanced lifters? That's the first part of the question. And also lifters that has been a little bit older, like myself, like you're closer to your 40s, even to your 50s, does that apply the same principle?
It should. Yeah. I think what we're talking about is not necessarily like just because they seem like novel ideas to us, like these lengthened partials, and they kind of sound like, your old school bodybuilding mentality of an intensity technique or an advanced technique. Um, your muscle doesn't think of it that way, right? So training at exercises that include higher tension and longer muscle lengths are just probably better, for that given muscle. I think the important thing to consider, though, is that you need to be a little more nuanced with this if you don't have a strong understanding of anatomy. So, for example, someone might conclude, why would I ever do a lying hamstring curl if I could do a seated where I'm in a greater stretch position and all my hamstrings are in a longer muscle length? Well, because your sartorius is not it's a knee flexor, but it doesn't attach in the same places. It attaches to the front of the hip. So when you're in a seated position, it's actually shortened. And the data we have shows that a lying leg curl is better for sartorius growth, while a seated leg curl is better for the hamstrings group. So if you kind of have an anatomy level that's, and I don't mean this to be like offensive, similar to the typical bodybuilder or bodybuilding magazine or article, it's like, oh, hamstring curls are for hamstrings, chest presses for chest, triceps or push downs are for triceps. And, like I wouldn't expect most people to have any more anatomical knowledge than that. You don't have to do a fucking bachelor's of sports science to be a bodybuilder, right? Nor should you. Um, and then you go, oh, I heard long muscle lengths are better, and you have a very black and white view, and it's like, okay, now I'm never going to train anything that's not a long muscle length. You can make some errors like that, right? You can neglect it. So it's probably better to take a more moderate approach rather than an extreme approach. But yeah, I wouldn't say it's necessarily an advanced technique. I think if your exclusive goal is hypertrophy, then you can kind of have all of your exercises done in a way that's for that purpose. There's a lot of people who do them also for performance and health. And if that's the case, I'd recommend learning the quote unquote traditional form before you go on modifying it. But if you're someone who's been lifting for a while and you're now just want to be a competitive bodybuilder or all you care about is the hypertrophy outcome, then that can just become your normal form. Having a slight pause at the longest position, um, using a more stretched cable variation and never doing like certain free weights for certain exercises because of the force curve or whatever. And I think that's totally defensible. But I think like as a general recommendation, if you ask me kind of for all lifters, I would probably say, hey, learn the traditional technique and then learn how to modify it for hypertrophy. And I would probably also say with the caveat that for free weight uh, multi-joint movements, I would be circumspect. I would be cautious before you start trying to modify these things because there's a higher technical demand. You're going to be more fatigued, and there's a higher injury risk. So, you know, deciding to do an 8RM 3-second pause squat, feet close, elevated on blocks with like barbell squats. I mean, what happens if things go poorly? Just consider it. Maybe that's better suited to a leg press, right? Um, Not that you can't perform it that way, but like the juice probably isn't worth the squeeze. Just simply having deep squats in your program in a comfortable way, considering that there's so many joints involved, the ankle, the knee, the hip, and your spine, I think is probably more important to think about from a longevity perspective, and then leave some of these modifications to exercises which are better suited for it.
Yeah, I
Makes
totally
sense.
agree. That's very, very well put. As you know, you guys mentioned, bodybuilding has the lowest amount of injury rate. This has been, it's not news, honestly. But then, you could also, expose yourself because of these variants. You could also expose yourself to these injuries and, unwanted injuries. And so like from just the longevities, but for leisure, I don't want to use that's the is a bad word, leisure bodybuilders. Is that a thing?
Recreational bodybuilders?
There you go. Yeah, thank you. Yeah,
Yeah.
recreational bodybuilders. So if let's say a case study, like if somebody has been doing recreational bodybuilding, no intent of stepping on stage, and he's been lifting for 10 years. He's lost his newbie gains. He's up in his 40s, and he's just kind of plateauing. And he's applied pauses, slower tempos, fast tempos, and in this scenario, is there something that you would change, or is there other things that you would look at?
Yeah, I think coming back to the context we've been talking about, this would be a great opportunity for them to assess, okay, are there certain muscle groups where I have not actually effectively produced high tensions at long muscle lengths? Because even if you are using a full range of motion and you're going close to failure, there are some exercises which are typical staples where maybe that hasn't occurred. I think probably the dumbbell lateral raise is like the most common one. I think that's probably, at least rewind it before the last couple of years of research came out and everyone started talking about it. People are doing dumbbell lateral raises far more frequently than they would be, cable lateral raises. And I think just a simple thing of like, let's try cables, you know, and other situations like that would be good. Like, you've always done dumbbell flies. And fortunately, at least you have that tension in the bottom position. Maybe you go to cables just to make sure it's constant. I think that's a less of a good example, but the dumbbell lateral raise is a really good one. You just kind of have to think through like that. Like, are there other movements where I can modify things? Standing leg extension, seated leg curls, for given those are other examples where you're able to get a little more stretch, but basically doing the same thing. And most people don't like seated leg curls; they're uncomfortable. There's like more things to adjust, and so like I get it. And doing a standing leg extension, you have to think about, okay, I'm gonna put a cuff on my ankle and go to the cable stack. There's a machine right there. I get to sit down. This is nice. I can watch YouTube videos while I do leg extensions. And then you go, wait a minute, maybe I'm not growing because I'm watching YouTube videos while I do leg extensions. So you fix that first, and then you go to the cable stack as well, and you get double the effects. So I think in this context, it's a stone that people didn't know could be overturned in many cases. Training at long muscle lengths, it was getting overturned in a lot of cases because we knew full range of motion was good. So yeah, but full range of motion doesn't necessarily always equal high tension at long muscle lengths. And the perfect example is that dumbbell lateral raise. So I think just kind of reframing things in that way is helpful in this case. Sometimes being more nuanced and technical is not helpful. Like, actually, it's not full range of motion, but training at a long muscle length. It kind of sounds like one of those things like, I'll quit nerding out. That doesn't matter. I train full range of motion, so I'm good. Maybe, maybe not. It depends upon your exercise selection. So this is one of the times that actually benefits you to dive a little deeper. Because you might find that you could get some gains you otherwise haven't. Because for those 10 years, this person has always been training, for the most part, with very little tension in a long muscle in a lengthened position, and therefore the quality of the work they're doing is substantially reduced, and they might be able to get some gains that they didn't know they could get.
Makes sense. In terms of the pausing too, like one thing I've noticed with being in competition prep, like adding a little pause, like obviously you're not gonna be able to lift as much weight. Do you think there could be a potential for like injury prevention when you're like really deep into prep and like your strength's coming down, to just essentially add pauses here and there, just so you don't have to use quite as much load?
Potentially, I couldn't say one way or the other. I think I can say that qualitatively, um, sometimes high loads independent of the volume are feel worse, on certain joints. This is easy to say as a power. Any power lifter would be like, absolutely. Some bodybuilders would not do that. I don't notice that. It's like, yeah, like a 6 RM is not that different from a 12 RM, but if I'm doing singles at 90% of one arm on a regular basis, I get this kind of deep joint ache from in certain joints from benching, squatting, and deadlifting. So if we kind of look across the aisle to the powerlifting world, they very intentionally use accessory movements that allow you to still get a high degree of muscular tension while lowering load to give joints a break. And that does happen in bodybuilders, especially those who train across a spectrum of rep ranges. They train in like the 4 to 6, sometimes the 3 to 5, as well as in the higher reps. Then that's a great opportunity. Like, okay, well, let me think about ways that I can just reduce the absolute load. And now all of a sudden I'm still training quote unquote heavy. I'm training in the 4 to 6 or the 3 to 5 rep range, but it's with 75% of the load, and it just doesn't hurt as much. You'll see programs in the strength world where they use front squats to get that same outcome. It's still a heavy set of 5, but your front squat's only going to be 2/3, 75% of your back squat anyway. And that's just one way to kind of unload the spine and the hips a bit. So absolutely valid. One thing I will say, that purposely emphasizing higher tensions at longer muscle lengths could possibly increase injury risk independently. Because I mean, if you think about it, like that's when muscle tears happen, right?
Yeah.
So I don't think it's a huge injury risk, but they're just two sides of the same coin. You know, the reason why you're seeing hypertrophy adaptations to stretch is to accommodate that higher tension, right? There's actually increases in sarcomeres and series, and the muscle is trying to get more resilient to being even to high tensions. That's part of the adaptation of hypertrophy. So you can worry about that, but I think so long as you're doing it intelligently and you're not just all of a sudden, that's another thing to consider. Like if you've never done anything except seated leg extensions and you decide for the first time to do standing with a cuff, standing leg extensions one leg at a time, even if you do the same set, reps, volume, load, RPE, you're going to be a lot more sore right in your rectus femoris because it's the first time it's ever been in that lengthened position and trained. Same thing if you're doing seated leg extensions and you've never seated leg curls and you've never done them, you've always done lying. The first couple of workouts, you're going to get more DOMS and have more exercise-induced muscle damage because there's higher tensions. So it's a good thing, but you just need to be aware of it and dose it in so that you get the benefit of the repeated bout effect, which gives you more protection against muscle damage. So yeah.
Sweet. No, makes sense. Makes sense.
That's a lot that we covered. Very, a lot of big insights that we talked about. Although there are some things that we trailed off into a lot of other stuff, but we gave a lot of like really good insights from a bodybuilding perspective and muscle hypertrophy perspective. We try to ask a little bit more different sides to things, and because I do ask these questions because some as a lot of our athletes are pretty much they want like specific answers to stuff, and they might ask to a perspective where it will be individualized, some individualization there. So they would probably want to ask these type of questions. Do you have anything else to add, Brandon? Any other questions
No.
you want to ask him since we have him here?
I think that's pretty much everything. I don't want to take too much of your time, and I know it's
No, don't
already
worry about it. I'm happy to answer as many questions you guys want.
Yeah. I would say maybe one more question then, if it doesn't matter with you. Yeah. I would say in terms of like mindset and like lifting too, because I know like some people when they go into the gym, maybe they've had like a really rough day at work or something, and they're going into the gym and they're just not in a good mindset, or if they're thinking that, oh, I'm gonna have a shitty workout. How do you think mindset and lifting works? Like if you have a lot of negative self-talk, do you think that's gonna impede your ability to lift a certain load? Because I know sometimes, like I've personally done this before, where I loaded up some weights and like it's actually more weight than I thought was actually on the bar, and then like I still performed just as many repetitions as I did with like the weight that I was supposed to be performing. So I was just interested to see if there's any like research on like negative self-talk and like lifting certain loads, and if that's going to have a significant impact on your ability to train.
Yeah, so there's not that specific research that I'm aware of negative self-talk as the variable, but there's a lot of related things. So they've done research in a strength conditioning setting where they showed different video clips before training, and they found that motivational videos, and I shit you not, um, pornography actually improved performance in these male athletes. Where I think they called it an erotic video. I don't know if it's straight up porn or just kind of had that theme. And they also like a documentary or like sad and like videos, and like the depressing videos actually had a negative impact on performance acutely. It's important to also kind of constrain what are the effect sizes we're talking about here. They're not massive. It's not like all of a sudden, you went from being a world record holder to now you can't even squat, the bar or anything like that. But it's a notable effect. There are also data where we look at what you were doing in terms of mental effort and distraction. So there are some studies on like doing what's called like a Stroop test. Have you ever seen those like tests online where they show you the word red, but it's in blue writing,
Oh yeah, yeah.
and then you have to like say like what the word is or what the color is.
Yeah.
Doing like 20 minutes of that, it really messes with your brain and creates a lot of mental fatigue. And then if you go into to train, it can have a negative impact on performance. That's been shown a few times, that the effect of mental fatigue on physical performance is significant. And there's also some interesting effects of music. So typically high energy music, and this is something I think most people know. So music has been shown to enhance performance in terms of strength and reps to failure. Another thing that has enhanced performance is the presence of spotters. Even if they don't touch the bar, people get a few more reps. And overall, there's positive data on like supervision. So having a personal trainer or a group X instructor, et cetera, that typically results in better outcomes. That's a little more complex. They could be pushing you closer to failure versus training on your own. It's not supervised. It's also not observed by the researchers, right? So it's a little different. So I think collectively, all of that would indicate that absolutely your mindset going into it can impact not only acute performance, but also potentially your gains overall. There's a study by Bartholomew and colleagues where they looked at university college lifters, and like in a weight training class, like that's what they were doing. And they then administered a survey and they asked them how many incidences of perceived life negative stress they have. And the individuals who had greater occurrence of perceived negative life stress had poorer strength gains than their lower stress counterparts. So absolutely, in an acute sense and in an accumulative sense, the mindset you bring into your training, the energy you bring into your training, what you're doing immediately beforehand, can absolutely have a negative or positive effect. And that's not something like what you don't want is like, oh shit, I heard Eric, he told me that my mindset beforehand is going to have a negative effect, and now I'm going to have anxiety about the fact that I had a bad day before I train. Like that's not facilitative. I think the take home message from this is you probably want to have some rituals and maybe even kind of internal rules about what does it mean when I go into the gym, you know? And so, for example, I'm going to have amnesia about my day when I step into the gym. I'm here for a purpose. This is me time. Obviously, it's a little different if you train with a workout partner at home, et cetera. You need to respect the fact that their them time is just as important as your me time. What? But anyway, and then perhaps like you spend 5 minutes meditating while you warm up, and that doesn't need to be anything expansive. It can just be clearing your mind, focusing on the task at hand, being mindful about something that is now, not whatever was going on. And easier said than done, right? That was stressful in the day. And sometimes it means like, okay, I'm just going to extend my warm up 5 minutes, whatever time I need to take to center myself and be here for this. And I'm going to put on some good music. I'm going to, visualize. I'm going to try to purposely, put out some positive, focused self-talk. I think that the inverse of all the negative things is that there's positive things that can help you. And I think that's an important thing to remember rather than being scared of, having a bad day and then making it even worse,
So pretty much summarizing, watch porn and upbeat music before you work out.
Got it. Yes. Just watch old Nelly videos that are uncensored, music videos, and you got this. Yeah.
Okay. Sounds great. It's a really good insight. That's like our main highlight for the entire podcast is how you can lift better is watch porn, upbeat music.
I don't know
how you tell your athletes to go into Sheffields.
I feel like the gorilla training was a close second, if not. So yeah. So I think those are the two big take homes here.
Yeah.
So.
All right. Anyways, so thank you so much again. I really appreciate your time explaining all these really good insights for muscle hypertrophy to us meatheads and making all of us better. I really appreciate that. Where can we find you?
Yeah, the best place to find me, the work I do, and the coaching of my colleagues, as you well know, is 3dmusclejourney.com. That is the number 3, the letter D, and then musclejourney.com. From there, you can find links to the 3D Muscle Journey podcast. There's our blogs, which are written by the whole team, including our specialists. And outside of that, and there's also links to my books, Mass. Outside of that, the only things that are not directly linked from 3D Muscle Journey are my appearances on other amazing podcasts like this, which I almost always repost on my Instagram at Helms3DMJ, and me and Omar being clowns for 2 hours. And then that's 2 hours giving you about 10 minutes of useful content at Iron Culture. So that's available on all podcast platforms.
We will link all those links in the description below for you guys to go ahead. I would really highly recommend you guys check out the 3DMJ. We are very proud athletes of 3DMJ. You know, as Brandon said, he works with Jeff. I've been working with Brian since 2019. How many years is that? 4?
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, 4 years ago. It doesn't feel like 4 years ago, but it was.
Yeah. I've been working with Brian for 4 years, and yeah, so you can see our bodies. You can go check out our Instagram. You can see how our physiques, you know, reflect 3DMJ. We are trained by, you know, Brian was messing with Alberto, saying that they technically are they're Arnold champion and IFB pro champ, something like that.
That's right. Yeah, only a few degrees of separation. Yeah. You need a flow chart to explain how he is Mr. Olympia, but it is defensible at the very least.
We will draw that out. We'll draw that out for all of you, your listeners there.
No, I was joking I was going to put this in my 3DMJ bio, actually, but Berto and I have always joked about how Craig Toth, another 3DMJ athlete, both of us at one point have beaten Craig in a show, and Craig beat Kai Green when Kai was a teen. And so by proxy, we're one above Kai Green, which is by definition Mr. Olympia.
So again, please find us on Spotify and Apple Podcast. If you are, again, as you're very familiar with this, a lot of people just leave us 5-star reviews. Exactly, 5-star reviews. That is the recommended review that we recommend. And also, if you guys have any questions, go on YouTube and leave us a comment down there. If you have any questions for Eric, you can leave them there as well. We'll answer them on behalf of him. And yeah, we will see you guys next week.